Mayday Fuel. That's what the pilot said. Not Mayday engine failure. Not Mayday fire.
Mayday Fuel, October 25th, 2022, Singapore Airlines Flight 319, a Boeing 777-300ER, 280 people on board, inbound from London Heathrow. And at that exact moment, this aircraft had less fuel remaining than what regulation allows as the absolute legal minimum, not close to it, below it.
I want you to sit with that for a second, because this is one of the most quietly terrifying near misses in modern aviation.
And almost nobody outside the industry has ever heard of it. No engine failure, no mechanical fault, no storm that came out of nowhere. Just a series of small decisions, each one reasonable on its own, that stacked together into a 280-person aircraft running dangerously low on gas over Southeast Asia. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, I'm going to walk you through exactly where I believe the indecision started, and I'll give you my honest verdict on who or what nearly killed everyone on that airplane. I'm Ryan Mitchell.
I spent over 2 decades flying wide-body jets, and this is the kind of incident that keeps pilots like me up at night. Not because it was rare, because it wasn't.
Let's set the facts first, because this case only makes sense once you understand the math behind it. Every commercial flight carries what's called final reserve fuel. Think of it as the fuel equivalent of your car's reserve tank light, except in aviation, it's not a warning, it's a hard legal floor. For a jet like the 777, that reserve is enough to hold at 1,500 feet for 30 minutes, nothing more.
It exists for exactly one purpose, so that if everything goes wrong on approach,
you still have enough gas to find a runway and land safely. For SQ319, that number was 3,024 kilograms. Below that line, you are no longer flying with a safety margin. You are flying on borrowed time. When SQ319 finally landed that morning, its fuel was significantly below that number, not close to the reserve, below it. And to understand how a fully fueled 777 departing London ended up there, we have to go back to the beginning of the descent into Singapore, because this wasn't one bad decision. It was 4 decisions, each one small, that never got corrected.
At 8:01 in the morning, while the aircraft was still approaching Singapore airspace, air traffic control told the crew to expect runway 20 right at Changi Airport.
At that point, according to the flight crew's own account, their onboard computer estimated they'd land with about 7,000 kilograms of fuel. That's more than double the legal reserve. Comfortable, routine. 4 minutes later, at 8:05, controllers put them into a holding pattern because of a tailwind on that runway. A minor inconvenience, the kind of thing that happens on approach into a busy airport almost every single day. While they were holding, the crew's weather radar showed something important. Heavy rain sitting directly over Changi Airport, and heavy rain over both of their 2 alternate airports. But one airport, Batam, across the water in Indonesia, was showing clear. At 8:10, air traffic control switched their landing runway again, this time to runway 2 left. More delay stacking on top of delay. At 8:22, a different controller, arrival control, took over and began vectoring them toward that new runway. Over the next 6 minutes, the weather at Changi kept getting worse. Visibility dropped to 2 nautical miles, then it kept falling. By 8:27, air traffic control made the call to stop accepting arrivals into Changi altogether so they could assess just how bad the weather had become. The crew was told to expect a 5-minute delay, and updates would follow. They were sent to another holding point and told to wait. And here's the moment I want you to really pay attention to, because this is where the story quietly turns. While en route to that new hold, the crew pulled the weather report for Batam, their clear weather alternate. It confirmed good conditions, and at 8:31, they told air traffic control something very specific. They said they could perform exactly 1 more hold, and after that, they would be down to emergency fuel. That's not a vague statement. That's a pilot doing the math and drawing a line. 1 hold, then we divert. That's the plan they stated out loud, on the radio, on record. 5 minutes later, as that 1 hold was finishing, the pilot monitoring asked air traffic control for an update. There wasn't one, and instead of diverting like they had just said they would, they told control they could perform 1 more hold. Then, 3 minutes after that, as they approached the end of that hold 2, they offered to fly 1 more circle, what's called an orbit, instead of committing to Batam. Air traffic control approved it. Twice now, the crew had stated a fuel limit out loud, and twice they pushed past it. Now, I need to be fair here, because judging this from a comfortable chair with the full timeline in front of me is very different from making decisions in real time in a cockpit with weather closing in on every option around you. Every one of those individual choices, taken alone, is defensible. Controllers hadn't formally denied Batam. The weather there was still reported as fine. There was still a chance Changi would reopen any minute. That's the trap. Each decision in isolation looked reasonable. It's only when you stack all four of them together that you see indecision. At 8:44, they finally committed: divert to Batam. And this is where something happens that I've genuinely never fully understood, and neither, I think, has the investigation. The captain, who had been monitoring up to this point, took over as the pilot flying. The first officer, who had been flying the aircraft, switched to monitoring. In a moment where the most valuable thing in that cockpit was clear thinking and fast decision-making, the most experienced pilot took his hands off the controls of decision-making and put them on the yoke instead. I'll come back to why I think that matters. Air traffic control turned them toward Batam. A minute later, the pilot monitoring asked again if Changi was accepting arrivals. It wasn't. At 8:48, they were handed to a different control agency, still without approval to divert confirmed. The pilot monitoring told controllers they were down to minimum fuel. 2 minutes after that, they were told Batam clearance was still pending. Still pending while sitting on minimum fuel, over open water, with no confirmed place to land. At 8:53, the pilot flying declared Mayday Fuel. At that moment, their estimated fuel on landing at Batam was calculated to sit right at the legal reserve, not above it anymore, at it. They were roughly 13 nautical miles from the runway. 2 minutes later, they finally got confirmation. Batam would give them priority to land. You'd think that's where this story calms down. It doesn't. As they lined up for runway 22, they were told about a tailwind gusting up to 30 knots, well beyond safe landing limits. The pilot flying broke off that approach at 1,600 feet and repositioned for a different runway, runway 04. Losing more fuel, more time, with the reserve now already gone. Here's where I need to explain something almost no passenger understands, because it's central to what happened next. Modern jets, like the 777, can land themselves using a system called auto-land. People assume that means the computer just handles it in bad weather. It doesn't work that simply. Auto-land requires the aircraft to be established on a very specific, stable approach path early, with the right signals locked in well before touchdown. It is not designed to be engaged as a last-second save when you're already close to the runway and off track. At 1,195 feet above the ground, with fuel now critically tight, the pilot flying disengaged the autopilot to try to manually capture the approach signals himself. He got the aircraft roughly aligned, re-engaged the autopilot at 668 feet, expecting the system to take over and land the plane automatically. Instead, his display flashed a message: no auto-land. According to his own account in the investigation, that message startled him. And in that moment of being startled, he noticed his instruments were showing the aircraft drifting badly off the runway's centerline and glide path, nearly full-scale deflection, meaning significantly off course, not slightly off course. He disengaged the autopilot again, and 20 seconds later, at just 132 feet above the ground, he executed a go-around. A go-around that low, that close to touchdown, with fuel that tight, is one of the more demanding maneuvers in commercial aviation. It worked. But it cost them more fuel they didn't have. They repositioned for a second attempt at that same runway. This time, breaking through the clouds, the aircraft was high and offset to the left of where it needed to be. The pilot flying increased the descent rate to correct it, and the aircraft's ground proximity system triggered a warning for an excessive rate of descent. Following procedure exactly as trained, he initiated a second go-around, this one at 212 feet. 2 go-arounds, on final reserve fuel. At an airport most 777 crews had likely never operated into before. Now they had one option left: a teardrop turn back around to runway 22, the one they'd originally abandoned because of a 30-knot tailwind. Conditions had shifted. The tailwind was now down to 15 knots, right at the aircraft's certified limit, and above the airline's own procedural limit of 10 knots for landing. With fuel now at a level the investigation would later describe only as significantly below the legal reserve, the pilot made the call. Land, now, on runway 22, tailwind and all. At 9:19 that morning, Singapore Airlines 319 touched down safely at Batam Airport. Zero injuries, zero damage, 280 people who had no idea, in that cabin, just how close this had come to becoming a very different story. So let's talk about what the official investigation actually found, because this matters more than any theory I could offer you. Singapore's Transport Safety Investigation Bureau released its final report roughly a year later. And here's something important I want to be upfront about. The report does not name a single official cause. It doesn't use the word blame. What it does instead is lay out a sequence of decisions and let the facts speak. And the facts point clearly toward one thing. The crew consistently preferred to hold and wait for Changi to reopen, rather than commit early to the one airport that had clear weather. Twice, they stated a fuel limit on the radio. Twice, they extended past it anyway. The investigators noted something that I think is the single most important sentence in this entire case. 3 other flights, dealing with the exact same weather, the exact same air traffic control information, made the decision to divert earlier. SQ319 was the 4th aircraft to eventually divert, and by the time they committed, the same storm system that had shut down Changi had begun moving south, directly toward Batam, their only good option. Had they diverted after that very first hold, the weather in Batam would likely have still been clear when they arrived. Waiting didn't just cost them fuel. It cost them their best option. Now let me separate what's confirmed from what's still open to interpretation, because I think that's exactly where the honest analysis lives. Confirmed: the fuel numbers, the timeline, the radio calls, the 2 go-arounds, the tailwind landing, the reserve breach. All of that comes directly from cockpit data and the official record. Open to interpretation: why the captain chose to take over as pilot flying at the exact moment the situation demanded the sharpest decision-making. The report doesn't explain that choice, and honestly, neither can I with full certainty. What I can tell you, from my own years flying long haul, is that under pressure, pilots sometimes default to the task that feels most controllable. Flying the airplane feels active. Deciding, especially deciding to abandon a plan you've already committed to twice, feels uncomfortable. My honest read is that swapping roles in that moment likely reduced the cognitive bandwidth available for the harder job, weighing diminishing fuel against a deteriorating weather picture in real time. That's my opinion, not an official finding. The investigation itself focused more on the Autoland confusion during the final approaches, which I actually think is secondary. The real story here isn't a system malfunction. Autoland behaved exactly as designed when the approach parameters weren't correctly established. The real story is a crew that kept choosing hope over commitment, one hold at a time, until hope ran out of runway. Here's where I land on this, and I want to be clear, this is my personal verdict, not a courtroom judgment. I don't believe this was a training failure. Both pilots were highly experienced. The captain alone had over 14,000 hours, more than 10,000 of them on this exact aircraft type. This wasn't a lack of skill. It was a pattern of optimism bias, a very human, very understandable tendency to believe the next 5 minutes will bring the good news you're waiting for. Every individual hold made sense. Every individual radio call made sense. But aviation doesn't grade you on individual decisions. It grades you on the sum of them, and the sum of these decisions put 280 people within roughly the weight of a large suitcase in fuel from a very different outcome. What actually saved this flight wasn't luck. It was 2 go-arounds executed exactly by the book when the numbers on the instruments didn't match reality, and a final approach flown with total discipline even as the fuel gauges were reading numbers no pilot ever wants to see. The airline's response afterward tells you everything about how seriously this was taken internally. They built new training specifically around this event, covering fuel management, diversion timing, and recognizing what's called attentional tunneling, the tendency to fixate on the plan you already have instead of stepping back and seeing the full picture. That training now exists because of what happened on this flight. That, to me, is the part of this story that actually matters most. Nobody was punished publicly. Nobody was named. But somewhere right now, a Singapore Airlines pilot is sitting in a classroom learning from exactly this sequence of decisions, so that the next crew facing a similar wall of weather divert earlier and doesn't need a Mayday call to do it. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this, it's that the most dangerous moment in a cockpit is rarely the mechanical failure. It's the moment where the safe decision and the comfortable decision start pulling in opposite directions, and nobody notices until the fuel gauge forces the issue. That's the story behind Singapore Airlines 319, not a broken airplane. a crew that kept hoping for 5 more minutes until 5 more minutes was all they had left. If you want more real breakdowns like this, straight from someone who's actually sat in that seat, make sure you're subscribed, because this is just one story from the cockpit, and there are a lot more worth telling.